So imagine you were holding this singular key to the survival of humanity.
Right, like the one thing that keeps it all going.
Exactly. And you didn't invent this key, right? It was handed to you miraculously by the creator of the
A
universe.
literal divine gift.
Yeah. And it comes with this ironclad guarantee, basically saying, through this key, I will save the world.
So you orient your entire existence around it.
You have to. You protect it with your life. But then, decades later, the exact same creator looks you in the eye and commands you to, well, to drop that key into a volcano.
Oh, wow.
And not as a metaphor. Literally, destroy the key and, by extension, destroy the promise.
I mean, it creates this terrifying cognitive dissonance because you are suddenly forced to choose between the character of the one who made the promise and the terrifying reality of the command they just gave you.
Right. And that collision, that space where the promise of God seems to violently contradict the command of God, that is exactly the territory we are exploring today.
It's heavy stuff.
It really is. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are unpacking a massive dossier today. It heavily features an essay and a series of these really complex visual infographics by Chris Arvelasas.
Titled, Divine Testing and Trust, Abraham's Sacrifice of Isaac.
Right, that's the one. And our goal today is to dissect one of the most provocative narratives in human history, which is Genesis 22.
Yeah, we really want to understand the underlying mechanics here, like why a deity who is universally described as loving would issue such a severe, almost unthinkable directive.
And what this specific ancient text reveals about the human capacity for trust. Plus, how this singular event effectively blueprints the entire biblical timeline.
Absolutely. And, setting the stage here requires us to peel back thousands of years of cultural varnish.
Yeah, we really tend to sanitize it.
We do. It is remarkably easy to flatten these ancient texts into simple, digestible moral fables.
With a Sunday school flannel graph.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We reduce a narrative of cosmic significance into like a cross-stitch pillow that says, Abraham obeyed, so you should obey too.
Which completely bypasses the immense gravity of the situation.
It really does. Doing that misses the point entirely. This isn't just a story about following rules. Isaac is not just a beloved child.
Right, he's the promise.
He is the literal, concrete embodiment of a cosmic covenant. To put Isaac on an altar is to put the entire future of redemptive history on an altar.
So to truly understand the theology, we have to start by looking at the psychological and linguistic reality of the command itself.
Let's unpack that.
The text opens with a very specific framing. It says, after these things, God tested Abraham. Now, to a modern ear, the word tested immediately triggers a defensive reflex.
Oh, for sure. It sounds like an ambush.
Yeah. It sounds like a teacher giving a pop quiz on material they know you haven't studied, specifically to watch you fail.
But that is a crucial distinction we have to make because the biblical framework operates on a completely different definition.
Okay, how so?
Well, the Hebrew concept of testing here, the word is nisa, is not about entrapment. The text actually makes a rigid distinction between a temptation and a test.
I feel like we use those words interchangeably today.
We do, but structurally, a temptation is designed to destroy. Its goal is failure. But a test, especially in this ancient Near Eastern context, is metallurgical.
Metallurgical, like metalworking.
Exactly. It's a furnace. When you apply intense heat to silver or gold, the goal isn't to destroy the metal.
Right, you want to refine it.
Yes. The
Yeah.
goal is to bring the impurities, the dross, to the surface so they can be scraped away. It reveals the pure substance underneath.
Okay, I understand the metallurgical metaphor, I do. But here is where the logic seems to break down for me.
Hit me.
If we accept the premise that God is omniscient meaning, he possesses total, exhaustive knowledge of everything past, present, and future, then he already knows exactly what the metallurgical composition of Abraham's heart is.
Right. He doesn't need a thermometer.
Exactly. He doesn't need to apply the heat to find out if there's dross. He already has that data. So running a man through this kind of severe psychological trauma just to gather information he already has seems, frankly, redundant and cruel.
And that is the exact tension you should be feeling when you read this. But the resolution lies in a concept called divine pedagogy.
Divine pedagogy. Okay, break that down.
The furnace isn't operating for the benefit of the metallurgist, right? It's operating for the benefit of the metal.
Oh, that's interesting.
God is not running an experiment to update his own cosmic spreadsheet. He knows Abraham perfectly. The test is for Abraham.
So it's about Abraham's self-discovery.
It is. It forces the abstract concept of faith to materialize in the concrete physical world. because until faith is severely stressed, it remains theoretical in the mind of the believer.
Like, you don't know if you're brave until you face danger.
Precisely. This test brings Abraham's ultimate allegiances to the surface so that Abraham himself can see them, and so that this faith becomes a visible, historical reality.
So it's less about God acquiring new data and more about God facilitating a structural transformation within Abraham. It bridges the gap between intention and reality.
Yes, and the way the transformation is initiated, the actual wording of the command, is surgically precise.
It really is brutal when you read it.
The text reads, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love."
The pacing there is just agonizingly deliberate.
God does not speak in vague terms. He identifies the target with escalating emotional intensity. He's driving the reality home with every single syllable.
And it's an escalation that highlights exactly what is at stake. Because, we have to remember the historical context for you listening. Abraham and Sarah waited decades for this child.
Long past the biological possibility of reproduction.
Right. Isaac is an anomaly. But far beyond the emotional attachment to a miracle child, Isaac represents the entire geopolitical and spiritual promise God made.
The promise that through this specific lineage, all the nations of the earth would be blessed.
So God is essentially commanding Abraham to dismantle the very evidence of God's own faithfulness.
That is the paradox at the heart of the narrative. The command is actively warring against the promise.
And Abraham's reaction to this impossible paradox is what fundamentally shifts our understanding of human agency in these texts.
Staggering.
The text simply states, "So Abraham rose early in the morning."
Just that.
The absence of dialogue there is wild, because if you look back earlier in the Genesis narrative, when God reveals he is going to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham engages in this intense, protracted negotiation.
Yeah, he haggles with God. He argues for justice for complete strangers.
But here, when commanded to sacrifice his own promised son, there's absolute silence. He just packs the wood.
And we shouldn't read that silence as an indication of a lack of emotion. It's an indication of an absolute, albeit agonizing, resolve.
It's like he's on autopilot, but driven by faith.
Exactly. It demonstrates a profound psychological reality. Faith often manifests as mechanical, obedient movement long before it coalesces into emotional clarity or logical understanding.
Which is such a stark contrast to how a modern individual processes catastrophic directives, right? Like if you receive a devastating medical diagnosis or there's a sudden catastrophic shift in your career.
The immediate modern reflex is the demand for explanation.
We require the why. We want a fully articulated rationale before we agree to take a single step forward into this new reality.
But Abraham bypasses the demand for explanation and moves straight into action.
Because he is operating on a different foundational paradigm. He is trusting the character of the commander, even when the command itself appears to violate every known metric of logic and morality.
He trusts the who, even if he doesn't understand the why.
Right. But operating on that paradigm isn't instantaneous. It's not a switch you just flip. The command is given, the supplies are packed, but the execution requires a brutal 3-day journey.
And this is where the narrative tension stretches to its absolute breaking point.
Yeah, the 3 days.
That 3-day gap functions as a psychological pressure cooker. It's a deliberate narrative device. It forces the reader to sit with the excruciating reality of what this obedience actually costs.
Every step up that mountain must have felt like an eternity.
And in biblical literature, the 3rd day is rarely just a chronological marker. It operates as a distinct motif. It's a rhythm deeply associated with the space between death and deliverance.
You really do see that rhythm everywhere. Like Jonah in the belly of the fish for 3 days, Jesus in the tomb for 3 days.
Exactly. The 3-day journey to Moriah is the geographical manifestation of that exact same space. It is the valley of the shadow of death.
And it's during this specific window that Abraham says something to his servants that fundamentally re-engineers our understanding of a very common concept.
Right, the statement about worship.
Yeah. He tells them, "I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." He specifically uses the word worship.
And the Hebrew word there is shaka, which implies bowing down or prostrating oneself. But the context here completely redefines its application.
Because the modern application of worship is almost exclusively tied to an event or a feeling. I mean, if you ask a random person today what worship is, they will describe an aesthetic experience.
Like a gathering, music, maybe a feeling of transcendence or comfort.
Exactly. But Abraham's working definition of worship is the agonizing, silent, active surrender of the most precious gift he has ever received. It posits that worship is inherently costly.
It strips away all the consumeristic layers we've applied to the concept of faith.
It really does.
The operational logic established here is that worship without surrender is structurally hollow. If the act of worship does not involve the relinquishment of the worshiper's own will, their own comfort, and their own treasures, it fails to meet the biblical criteria.
Abraham is actively valuing the character of God above the gifts of God.
Exactly.
But the tension in that sentence isn't just about the word worship. It's the end of the sentence that always gets me. We will come again to you. Plural. We.
It's a massive detail.
Analyzing this psychologically, is Abraham lying to the servants to prevent a panic? Or he's in a state of severe denial about what he is about to do?
Well, according to the later texts, is neither deception nor denial. It is the application of what theologians call resurrection logic.
Resurrection logic. I like that phrase.
The New Testament, specifically the 11th chapter of Hebrews, provides a retrospective analysis of Abraham's cognitive process in this exact moment. It explicitly states that Abraham considered that God was able to raise Isaac from the dead.
Which requires an immense ontological leap. I mean, resurrection was not an established theological category in the ancient Near East.
No, not at all.
Abraham didn't have a library of texts detailing the resurrection of the dead. There was no precedent for this in human history.
None. He deduces the concept of resurrection purely through a logical synthesis of God's character.
Walk us through that logic.
Sure. So Abraham holds two absolute truths in his mind. Truth A, God has commanded the sacrifice of Isaac.
Okay.
Truth B, God has sworn an unbreakable covenant that through Isaac the world will be blessed.
And those contradict.
Exactly. But since Abraham knows God cannot lie and cannot violate his own covenant, the only rational synthesis of those two truths is that God will allow the sacrifice to occur and then immediately reverse death itself to fulfill the promise. He deduces the necessity of resurrection centuries before it becomes a formalized theological doctrine.
So his faith isn't blind at all. It is hyperlogical. It's based on the axioms of God's nature.
Precisely.
But even with that incredible deduction, the physical reality of the moment is still closing in. They begin the final ascent up the mountain. And this introduces a highly significant logistical detail.
The wood.
Yes. Isaac is carrying the wood for the burnt offering. He isn't a passive toddler being carried up there. He's a young man capable of carrying a massive load of wood up a mountain.
And Isaac is highly perceptive. He looks at the supplies and he asks, "Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?"
That has to be arguably the most loaded question in ancient literature.
It breaks your heart just hearing it. And Abraham's response is a masterclass in what we might call theology formulated under extreme pressure.
God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son.
Yes. That phrase, theology under pressure, is vital here because it is relatively simple to construct an airtight theological worldview when you are insulated from suffering.
When you're sitting in a comfortable armchair, sure.
Right. But Abraham is constructing this worldview while walking his son to an altar. Notice the mechanics of his answer. He does not offer Isaac a detailed logistical breakdown.
He doesn't say, well, God asked me to sacrifice you, but I've deduced he will resurrect you, so it will be fine.
Exactly. He simply anchors the impending reality to the character of the provider. He places the entire weight of the unknown outcome squarely onto the nature of God.
And that abstract trust has to materialize into physical action, because they finally reach the summit of Moriah.
And the text is just unflinching here.
It is. Abraham builds the altar, he arranges the wood, he binds Isaac. And we really have to address the mechanics of this binding, which is known in the Jewish tradition as the Akedah.
The Akedah, yes.
Because, as we establish, Isaac is a strong young man. Abraham is well over 100 years old. The physics of this scene dictate that Isaac had to willingly submit to being bound.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
If Isaac had chosen to resist, the narrative ends right there. He could have easily overpowered his father.
He just walks away.
Exactly. The profound reality of the Akedah is that it is a dual surrender. You have a father surrendering the promise and the son surrendering his life. They are mutually submitting to an incomprehensible directive.
So Isaac is bound. He's on the altar. Abraham reaches out and takes the knife. The tension is absolute. The blade is literally in the air.
The promise is seconds away from apparent termination.
And then the intervention happens. The angel of the Lord calls out, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me."
The intervention establishes the true nature of the test. And that phrase, "now I know that you fear God," requires careful parsing.
Because in the modern lexicon, fear implies terror, right? Or a desire to flee from a threat.
Right, but the biblical concept of the fear of the Lord operates differently.
It isn't about cowering in a corner waiting for a lightning bolt. So what are the actual mechanics of fearing God in this specific context?
It refers to a state of ultimate reverence and absolute unrivaled allegiance. It means the gravitational center of your value system is God himself, not the things God provides.
Wow.
By raising the knife, Abraham definitively proved that he loved the giver more than he loved the gift, even when the gift was the very mechanism of God's own covenant.
He refused to let the promise become an idol. And that is a psychological trap that is incredibly easy to fall into.
We all do it.
You desire a good thing, a healthy family, a successful career, a secure future, and when you attain it, the gift slowly displaces the giver in your hierarchy of values.
But Abraham proves his hierarchy is intact. And the moment that allegiance is verified, the narrative pivots sharply. Abraham looks up and sees a ram caught in a thicket by its horns.
And this is the structural hinge of the entire biblical narrative, right? The ram is not a coincidence. It introduces the operational logic of substitution.
Which becomes the foundational mechanism for all biblical redemption.
Let's break down the mechanics of substitution for a second. To a modern listener, the idea of an animal dying in place of a human can feel primitive or arbitrary. Like, why does substitution matter?
To understand it, you have to look at the moral physics of the biblical worldview. If a rebellion occurs or a wrong is committed, justice requires a cost. Life is required.
Right.
The principle of substitution, which will later be codified in the Levitical sacrificial system, is that innocence bears the consequence so that the guilty, or in this case the bound, can go free. The ram dies so the promised son can live.
It is a physical demonstration of grace operating through justice.
Beautifully said.
And Abraham immediately recognizes the magnitude of this provision. He untangles the ram and offers it in place of his son, and then he names the location. But he doesn't name it to commemorate his own obedience. He names it YHWH.
And the linguistic depth of YHWH is really fascinating. It is commonly translated as, the Lord will provide. But the Hebrew root ra primarily means to see.
Oh, to see.
Yeah. A more accurate translation would be, the Lord will see to it. It merges the concepts of perception and provision.
That's incredible.
It implies that God intimately perceives the deficit, the need, and the desperation, and through that perceiving, he actively supplies the exact necessary answer.
That fundamentally changes the geometry of the text. It isn't just a cold transactional provision like a vending machine. It is deeply relational. God sees the raised knife, he sees the agony, and he sees to it that the substitute is there.
Exactly. And in response to this completed test, God reaffirms the covenant, swearing by himself to multiply Abraham's offspring and bless the nations.
Now, this specific moment of vindication is at the center of major theological debate centuries later, right? Between the New Testament writers Paul and James.
Yes, it is one of the most famous apparent contradictions in theology. In the book of Romans, Paul argues fiercely that Abraham was justified, meaning declared righteous before God by faith alone.
Right. Paul points back to Genesis 15, years before Isaac was even born, when Abraham simply believed God's promise about having a son, and it was counted to him as righteousness.
But then James, in his epistle, points to this exact moment on Mount Moriah and says Abraham was justified by works when he offered Isaac on the altar.
Which on the surface looks like two completely incompatible systems of salvation. One says faith alone, the other says action is required. How does this deep dive reconcile that tension?
By understanding that Paul and James are looking at the same ontological reality from two different camera angles. They are addressing two different problems.
Okay, what was Paul addressing?
Paul is combating the idea that you can earn God's favor through perfectly executing religious laws. He rightly points out that the core relationship was established by faith long before the law existed.
And
James, however, is combating the idea of a hollow intellectual faith, a belief that exists only in the mind but never affects the hands or feet.
So James is saying that the faith that justified Abraham in Genesis 15 is the exact same faith that drove him up Mount Moriah in Genesis 22.
Exactly. Genesis 22 doesn't earn the righteousness, it vindicates it. It proves it is genuine. True faith, in the biblical matrix, is kinetic. It moves.
The internal reality of Genesis 15 is externalized and verified by the obedience of Genesis 22.
You've got it.
That is a profound clarification. But, having that theology in the abstract is one thing. To really grasp the scale of what happened on Moriah, we have to look at the shadow it casts forward in time. As the material we are studying points out, Genesis 22 is functionally an incomplete narrative if you isolate it.
It is deeply incomplete. Think back to Isaac's question, where's the lamb?
Right.
Abraham's answer is that God will provide the lamb. But God doesn't provide a lamb on Moriah. He provides a ram.
Wait, a ram, not a lamb.
Exactly. A ram is a fully grown male sheep. A lamb is a young sheep. The specific request for a lamb hangs in the air, unanswered, echoing across centuries of history.
The narrative tension remains unresolved until the opening chapters of the New Testament, when John the Baptist points at Jesus of Nazareth and declares, "Behold, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world."
That's the moment. And the structural parallels between the event on Moriah and the crucifixion at Calvary are so precise they defy coincidence.
Let's lay those out because the symmetry is breathtaking.
Let's trace the architecture. First, you have the beloved son. Isaac is the only son of the promise, deeply loved by his father. Jesus is the uniquely begotten son of the Father, deeply loved.
Okay.
Second, you have the journey. Isaac carries the wood for his own sacrifice up the incline of the mountain. Jesus carries the wooden crossbeam for his own sacrifice up the incline of Golgotha.
The logistics of the wood is such a specific, haunting detail. I mean, carrying the instrument of your own death.
It is. Third, you have the mutual surrender. Isaac willingly submits to the binding. Jesus willingly submits to the nails, stating elsewhere that no one takes his life, but he lays it down of his own accord.
The Akita mirrored in the cross.
Yes. And fourth, you have the substitution. On Moriah, a substitute is provided so that Isaac can live. At Calvary, Jesus is the substitute provided so that humanity can live.
It's as if Genesis 22 is the architectural blueprint and the Gospels are the fully constructed building.
Yeah.
And the New Testament writers were acutely aware of this. The source material highlights a specific linguistic bridge in Romans 8.32 that locks these two events together.
It is the interpretive key to the entire parallel. In Genesis 22, God says to Abraham, "Take your son, your only son whom you love," and later commends him because he did not withhold his son.
And in Romans 8.
Paul writes of God the Father, "He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things?"
The operational logic there is astounding. God did not demand of Abraham a sacrifice. He was unwilling to make himself. God stayed Abraham's hand. He stopped the knife. But centuries later, on a different hill on that same mountain range, God did not stay his own hand. He absorbed the full cost of the cosmic rebellion himself.
When you understand that, the narrative of Genesis 22 transforms entirely. It ceases to be a terrifying story about a demanding deity and becomes this devastatingly intimate preview of God's own self-sacrificial love.
It radically reorients how we view the nature of God. And this pattern testing, substitution, and provision is not isolated to just Abraham and Jesus. It is the underlying algorithm of the entire biblical cosmos.
Which is where those infographics come in.
Right. The infographics we are analyzing map this specific theme across 12 distinct stages of redemptive history.
You need to explore these 12 stages because they show how this single mountain peak connects to the entire tectonic plate of the biblical narrative.
Let's do it. Let's start at stage 1, eternity. How does Moriah connect to the time before time?
It establishes that the cross was not a reaction. The provision of the lamb was not a divine plan B initiated because humanity unexpectedly rebelled.
It wasn't an audible called at the line of scrimmage.
Exactly. The texts in 1 Peter and Revelation describe Christ as the lamb slain before the foundation of the world. The mechanism of substitutionary sacrifice was built into the eternal decree of God long before Genesis 22 ever occurred in space and time. Moriah is just the moment the curtain pulls back and lets humanity see the eternal plan.
Which leads to stage 2, creation. How does the act of creating the physical universe tie into the logic of sacrifice?
Well, creation establishes the baseline ontology of existence, which is absolute dependence. Everything that exists receives its life from the Creator. Therefore, the Creator holds the ultimate right to that life.
So Abraham's willingness to return Isaac to God is a reflection of the proper, uncorrupted order of the universe, where the creature perfectly trusts the Creator's right to give and take life.
You nailed it. But that uncorrupted order didn't last, which brings us to stage 3, the fall.
Right, the rebellion.
The fall explains the necessity of the test. Humanity rejected that posture of dependence. We developed disordered affections. We began to love the gifts of creation more than the Creator himself.
We made idols out of good things.
Exactly. Because our internal hierarchy is broken, we cannot safely handle the blessings of God without them becoming idols that destroy us. The test on Moriah is the necessary furnace to begin reordering the human heart back to its pre-fall state.
Got it. Now, stage 4 is covenant. God responds to the fall not with immediate annihilation, but by binding himself to a specific family line through Abraham.
And the test on Moriah is the ultimate stress test of that covenant. It proves that the covenant does not rely on biological inevitability or human effort, but entirely on God's miraculous ability to bring life out of apparent death.
Okay, move to stage 5, redemption, specifically the Exodus. We see the mechanics of Moriah scaled up to a national level here, right?
Yes, big time. The ram in the thicket is the prototype for the Passover lamb in Egypt. Just as the ram's death shielded Isaac from the knife, the blood of the Passover lamb shields the Israelite households from the judgment sweeping over Egypt.
It is the exact same logic of substitutionary deliverance, just scaled from one family to an entire nation.
Perfect parallel.
Which brings us to stage 6, kingdom. The promise made on Moriah that all nations would be blessed begins to materialize as Israel is established.
And the blueprint suggests that the kingdom of God expands not through military domination, but through the kinetic, obedient faith demonstrated by Abraham.
But the tragedy of the Old Testament is that the nation of Israel repeatedly fails to exhibit that kinetic faith, which brings us to stage 7, exile.
Yeah, the nation faces its own corporate tests. When threatened by surrounding empires, will they trust the invisible God, or will they make alliances and worship the idols of their neighbors?
And unlike Abraham, they fail the test. They refuse to surrender their false security.
So they're subjected to exile. The exile is essentially a severe corporate version of the testing furnace. It strips away all their gifts, the land, the temple, the monarchy, to expose their disordered affections and their desperate need for internal rewiring.
Which necessitates stage 8, restoration. The prophets begin to speak not just of returning to the land, but of a fundamental change in human capacity.
The prophets realize that humanity, even with the law and the temple, cannot consistently pass the test. The human heart is too compromised.
So the promise shifts.
Yes. God declares that he will supply not just the substitute, but the internal capacity to trust. He promises a new heart and a new spirit. He will provide what he demands.
Setting the stage for the ultimate provision, stage 9, Messiah. This is the culmination of the entire architectural plan we just discussed. Moriah is fulfilled at Calvary, the ultimate lamb is provided, and the cosmic debt is absorbed.
And the implications of that provision dictate stage 10, the church.
This is where it gets highly practical for the listener.
It really does, because the modern community of believers doesn't just intellectually assent to the fact that Jesus died. They are called to adopt the kinetic posture of Abraham and the cruciform posture of Jesus.
Meaning the Christian life is structurally designed around surrender. Taking up a cross, denying oneself, offering your life as a living sacrifice. The church is meant to embody the Akida in its daily operational logic.
Exactly. Which prepares humanity for stage 11, judgment, the final evaluation of history.
If the tests in this life are meant to reveal what we truly revere, then the final judgment is simply the ultimate, inescapable exposure of those allegiances. The furnace will reveal whether our gravitational center was the creator or the created things.
And for those whose allegiance was anchored in the Creator, we reach the final step, stage 12, millennium and new creation.
The end of the road.
This is the permanent cessation of the furnace. The testing is over, the dross has been removed. The promise that Abraham saw only in shadows is fully realized in a restored physical universe where the communion between the giver and the receiver is never again threatened by disordered love.
Wow. That 12-stage progression is a massive paradigm shift. It takes an isolated, bizarre story in Genesis and makes it the load-bearing pillar for the entire history of the cosmos.
It connects everything.
It really does. But, and we have to address this directly because this text is so structurally essential, misinterpreting the mechanics of this story can generate some incredibly toxic, dangerous theology. We need to navigate these hazards carefully.
Absolutely. The stakes for misinterpretation are very high.
Let's look at the pitfalls the source material identifies. First and foremost, the accusation of divine cruelty. I mean, let's be real. To someone outside the biblical framework, a deity demanding the slaughter of a child is indistinguishable from a horror movie villain.
It is a completely rational reaction if you isolate the command from its historical context and its ultimate conclusion.
So what's the context we're missing?
To understand the text, we have to look at the cultural environment of the ancient Near East. In the Canaanite culture surrounding Abraham, child sacrifice was a normalized institutional practice, particularly directed toward deities like Molech.
Molech. And the logic of Molech worship was essentially a transactional bribe, right? The gods are angry, The cosmic order is unstable, so you must offer your most valuable asset, your firstborn child, to purchase fertility or reign or military victory.
Precisely. The pagan deities demanded blood to maintain the status quo. Now, when Yahweh issues the command in Genesis 22, Abraham would have recognized the form of the demand. It mirrored the cultural expectations of a supreme deity.
So it wasn't out of left field for that era.
No, it wasn't. But the shocking subversion of the narrative isn't the command, it's the intervention. By stopping the knife and providing the ram, Yahweh is actively decoupling himself from the gods of Canaan.
He is essentially saying, I have the right to demand what Molech demands because I am the true creator, but I fundamentally reject the mechanics of Molech. I do not consume your children to sustain my power. I provide the substitute to sustain your life.
It is a brilliant redemptive subversion. He uses the cultural language of the day to definitively break the cultural paradigm. The narrative is aggressively anti-child sacrifice. It reveals a God of life who brings resurrection out of dead ends, not a deity of death.
Which directly addresses the second major pitfall, using this text as a license for religious fanaticism.
Oh, this is a dangerous one.
Because throughout history, individuals have committed horrific acts and claimed, God told me to do it, just like he told Abraham.
And that is a catastrophic misapplication of the text's mechanics. Genesis 22 is a singular, unrepeatable, redemptive historical node. Its specific purpose was to establish the architectural blueprint for the atonement of Christ.
It's a one-time event with a specific purpose.
Exactly. It is descriptive of a unique moment in cosmic history, not prescriptive as a template for universal behavior. You cannot use Moriah to justify bypassing objective morality. God was establishing a specific theological framework, not handing out blank checks for zealotry.
That's a vital distinction.
Okay.
And the third pitfall is something much more subtle, but perhaps more common in modern settings.
Demoralizing.
Right, reducing the story to mere moralizing.
This is what we call the Pelagian trap. If we teach this story merely as Abraham was highly obedient and God rewarded his obedience, therefore you should try harder to obey, we completely castrate the power of the narrative.
We turn it back into a self-help seminar.
Yes. And while kinetic faith is required, if human performance is the primary takeaway, we have missed the entire point of the ram. We have missed the gospel.
Because the hero isn't Abraham.
The ultimate hero of Genesis 22 is not Abraham's stellar obedience, it is God's miraculous provision. If we moralize the text, we place the burden of salvation back onto human shoulders, which is exactly what the substitute was designed to prevent.
We have to remember that Isaac walks down the mountain. The story is fundamentally about the provision of life.
It always comes back to life.
So we've analyzed the ancient context, we've traced the cosmic architecture across 12 stages, and we've cleared the interpretive minefield. The crucial step now is to synthesize all of this into the present reality of the listener.
The so what of it all.
Exactly. How does the operational logic of Genesis 22 interact with your life today?
It interacts by forcing a very uncomfortable, deeply diagnostic question. What is your Isaac?
Right. What is the entity, the relationship, the goal, or the asset in your life that you are holding with such a death grip that if you were asked to surrender it, your entire identity would collapse?
The furnace of testing isn't usually about a literal altar. It is about diagnosing the structural integrity of your priorities. The psychological reality of idolatry is that when you derive your ultimate meaning and security from anything other than the Creator, that thing becomes a structural vulnerability.
It's like a highly leveraged financial portfolio.
Let's hear the analogy.
So if you margin your entire net worth against a single volatile stock, the moment that stock dips, you are entirely wiped out. When we margin our emotional and spiritual stability entirely against our careers, our children's success, or our political affiliations, we become incredibly fragile. The moment those things are threatened, our world ends.
And God's demand for surrender is not the demand of a petty tyrant who wants to deprive you of joy. It is the intervention of a surgeon removing a tumor.
Wow.
He asks you to surrender your absolute reliance on the gift because he knows that finite gifts cannot bear the weight of human worship. Idols eventually crush the people who worship them. He demands the surrender of your Isaac to free you from that fragility.
The source material issues a very specific warning regarding this dynamic for people in leadership or ministry. It is remarkably easy for the mechanisms of faith to become idols themselves.
It is the most subtle trap of all. You begin with a genuine desire to serve God. You build a ministry, a charity, a community. But over time, the metrics of that success, the attendance, the influence, the reputation as a wise leader, slowly migrate to the center of your value system.
And suddenly you're serving the machinery instead of the creator.
You end up serving the machinery of the promise rather than the Lord of the promise. Genesis 22 demands that leaders continuously place their own influence on the altar and verify that their allegiance remains tethered to the giver, not the growth.
But practically speaking, how does someone navigate the space between the command and the provision? Because many people listening right now are currently walking their own 3-day journey to Moriah.
Yeah, a lot of people are in that dark space.
They are in a season where what they know about God's goodness is violently colliding with the catastrophic reality of their circumstances.
Genesis 22 provides the vital framework for pastoral care in those exact moments. When someone is in the agonizing space of the 3-day journey, the worst thing you can do is offer them cheap, transactional cliches.
God won't give you more than you can handle.
Exactly. We cannot flatten the reality of their pain. The journey is dark, the silence of God feels deafening, and the command feels impossible. But we can tether them to the mechanics of trust that Abraham utilized.
We don't promise them that we know how God will resolve the paradox. We promise them that we know the character of the God who will resolve it.
We point them to YHWH Jireh, the God who sees to it.
And building the capacity to trust that God requires intentional spiritual formation.
Yeah.
Right? You don't instantaneously generate the kinetic faith of Abraham in a moment of crisis.
No, you don't. That kind of structural integrity is forged over a lifetime of micro-surrenders. It requires a disciplined rhythm of prayer, deep meditation on the texts that reveal God's character, and a baseline readiness to obey, even when the logistical outcome is obscured.
You learn to trust that the parachute works by jumping off smaller ledges before you are thrown out of the airplane.
That's a great way to put it.
Well, we have excavated an immense amount of theological bedrock today. We started with the terrifying paradox of a command that seemed designed to destroy the covenant. We analyzed the agonizing silence of a father walking his son up a mountain, armed with nothing but the revolutionary logic that God could reverse death itself.
A journey that changed everything.
We watched the knife rise, only to be stopped by the voice of the God who provides a substitute, overturning the bloody expectations of the ancient world. And we traced the shadow of that ram through the centuries, watching it perfectly align with the cross of Calvary, where God did for humanity what he stopped Abraham from doing.
It is a narrative architecture that fundamentally rewires how you perceive suffering, how you diagnose your own allegiances, and how you understand the staggering cost of cosmic redemption.
It really does.
But as we close this deep dive, I want to introduce a slightly different paradigm for you to consider regarding this ultimate test.
Let's hear it. Leave us with something to chew on.
When we read Genesis 22, we almost universally frame the test as a question of allegiance. Did Abraham love God more than he loved Isaac? And while that is certainly true, what if there is another layer to the psychology of that surrender?
Okay, what layer?
What if the ultimate test on Moriah wasn't just about Abraham proving his love for God, but about Abraham trusting that God loved Isaac more than Abraham did?
Oh, that shifts the entire center of gravity.
Think about it. As a parent, your deepest fear is that no one will protect your child the way you can. The ultimate act of surrender isn't just yielding to a superior authority. It is the radical acknowledgement that the Creator's capacity to care for, sustain, and fulfill the destiny of your most precious gift infinitely exceeds your own capacity.
So placing your Isaac on the altar is less about proving your loyalty and more about transferring the object of your love into infinitely more capable hands.
Precisely. You aren't just giving it up, you are entrusting it upward. The surrender is an admission that God is a better father to your dreams, your children, and your future than you could ever be.
That is a profound reframing of what it means to trust. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Take time this week to identify the Isaacs in your life, examine the structural integrity of your trust, and consider whether you are ready to place them in the hands of the God who sees to it. We will catch you on the next one.